What makes a god? Is it some special lineage? Some unique power? Is it their unique comprehension, gnosis of the world? Or their role in its creation? Or perhaps it is their ability to inspire and compel worship? And finally, how about the related question, what makes a legitimate ruler? Often the answer to this question is predicated upon and intertwined with the answer to the first. Thus the emergence of divine rulers, god kings, and divine mandates. Throughout history, people and societies have struggled with these questions, answering them in very different but also often convergent ways throughout time. History is littered with examples of the power wielded by anyone who can convince his people he is a divine ruler. The Great Pyramids of Giza stand a physical testament to this power, 5,000 years after they were constructed as a tomb by the thousands of people who believed their pharaoh to be a god. Likewise, the Persians believed their king of kings to be a god, and the Japanese emperors still claim descent to this day from the sun god Amaterasu. Many millions of people still eagerly await the arrival of a new heaven and earth, ruled over by none other than Jesus Christ himself. In Elden Ring, there are many gods, greater and lesser, outer and human. But the consistent answer it gives us to those opening questions is that the god rulers of Elden Ring are those who control the ability to produce new life, and with that power, compel the worship of the masses. In the last episodes, we saw the worship of the Erdtree and its life-giving powers, presided over by the god Queen Marika, as she bestowed the blessings of sacred sap that would fall onto her bed and be used in the ritual creation of new members of the Orthodox through a form of baptism. In this episode, we will see how Miquella attempted to recreate this system anew in the Haligtree, as well as the important ways in which he tried to deviate from it. His new order, one of unalloyed gold, was modeled after the same processes which had begotten him, but was tragically halted by the intervention of a rival half-brother. This is the story of Miquella's doomed attempt to bring salvation to the lands between through rebirth. Our story of the Haligtree begins far away, down south, where the race of persecuted folk known as the Albinaurics were born, or, should we say, created. We'll leave the details of their creation, from the ripples of a drop of celestial dew onto a silver tear, for a future episode, but suffice it to say for now that several item descriptions make it clear that they were born from human hands via some now lost ritual process, and as such, being born outside the birthing orthodoxy, discussed in the previous episode, they are without grace. They are also evidently without the ability to reproduce themselves, as there are only 2 discrete generations of Albinaurics, suggesting 2 distinct mass production events, and Latenna's questline involves the delivery of a sacred object which will grant them the ability to produce new births. Anyone who has seen our past 2 episodes will know the significance of this innovation. It is for these exact reasons today that the Albinaurics are persecuted, living testaments to their heretical birthing origins. At each of the locations where we find Albinaurics in high density, the Albinauric village, the Volcano Manor, and even the immigrant exclave of Landell, we see their persecutors, the Omen Killers, not far away, endlessly pursuing their prey. Given this life of persecution, it is no surprise that the Albinaurics would seek safety, seek asylum. Eventually, we are told, the royal Carian knight Loretta embarks on a journey to find them their promised land, and comes to discover that the Haligtree is their best chance for salvation. not just asylum, but salvation, the latter giving a religious connotation to match the obvious allusion to the biblical Hebrews and their own promised land of Israel. But what salvation were they promised? To answer this, we turn finally to the mystery of Miquella's Haligtree. What is immediately clear from the first moments after arriving to the Haligtree is that it is not healthy. Its once massive trunk has been split, and the remaining minor branches are infested, bearing the unmistakable evidence of scarlet rot. Even in this state, though, we can see that it still produces amber sap, used in the baptismal rites. Its sap even bears resemblance to myrrh, a tree resin used for millennia in aromatics, medicine, and Christian religious rites, just as the sacred tears of Chios are. As we descend further toward the base of the Haligtree, we enter the holy city of El Fayel, Brace of the Haligtree. This structure may have been built to support the Haligtree as it grew, fed from its time as a sapling with Miquella's own blood, until it would be strong enough to support its own weight, similar to how trellises are used in the real world. Although actually, its size indicates it was built after the Haligtree was fully grown, likening it more to a tree stake or brace used for supporting struggling trees, a topic we will return to in the near future. But what was the purpose of the actual tree? Why did Miquella go through all the trouble of feeding a competitor to the Erdtree with his own blood? Well, regular listeners may already know what's coming. All throughout El Fayel, we can see the unmistakable ritual implements of sacred tear baptisms. Baptismal fonts are placed in characteristically prominent locations, as are the tear collection basins to collect the amber sap sacred tears from the boughs of the Haligtree. We know from the Miquella Knight Sword that the Haligtree did produce its own amber, as it reads, quote, "Sword forged by servants of Miquella of the Haligtree, with a design modeled after those carried by Carian knights. Instead of glintstone, however, amber from the Haligtree is embedded in the blade. A sumptuous piece, yet it has never been offered to any knight. An ill-starred sword with no master." End quote. Even the covered plaza gazebos seen in Landel are also present in the Haligtree, although with some minor modifications. So we can see clearly that Miquella attempted to recreate the ritual baptism of the Erdtree here in the Haligtree, the only other example in-game of such an effort. This is consistent with the naming Haligtree, Heilig meaning holy in German. But unlike the Erdtree's baptismal fonts, which have all completely fallen into disuse, we can see in the Haligtree evidence of relatively recent usage of the ritual fonts. As I'm sure you've all noticed, scattered around the Haligtree baptismal fonts we find cocoons, and these reveal Miquella's first major deviation from the Erdtree birthing orthodoxy. The cocoons, upon closer inspection, show humanoid forms, all prostrate in prayer, in various degrees of metamorphosis, from those clearly more humanoid to those almost completely cocooned. And, while we find the cocoons scattered throughout the holy city, we see by far the highest concentration of them around the baptismal fonts, making it clear that they are the product of the baptismal ritual. So it seems, rather than merely replicating the birthing ritual of the Erdtree, Miquella used his own version of this ritual, baptism not of newborns, but baptism of adults, to give them life anew, and allow them to be reborn into grace once they complete their metamorphosis. And here we have an answer to one of our initial questions. What did the Albinaurics seek in the Haligtree?
Starry
It seems obvious now that the allure of the Haligtree to those who were not born through orthodox means, to those born without grace, would be a chance to be baptized as an adult, a chance to metamorphose, a chance to be born again. And sure enough, we can see that some of the cocoons that are early on in their metamorphic process clearly appear to be the first generation Albinaurics, from their elongated slender limbs, prominent vertebral spinal processes, and similar characteristic pose. So it seems many of the first generation Albinaurics, at least, did indeed make it to their promised land. But interestingly, we don't see any adult forms, that is, post-metamorphosis forms, in the Haligtree, at least not that we know of. The cocoons themselves, as has been pointed out by others, are similar in appearance to the cocoons of the silk moth Bombyx mori, and interestingly, just like the Albinaurics, Bombyx mori is unable to reproduce without human hands, the product of thousands of years of selective breeding. Regardless, it's not like we see any giant moths flying around the Haligtree. In fact, the cocoons all appear to be arrested mid-metamorphosis, indicating some abrupt event that interrupted their transformation. Of course, Miquella himself was embedded into the roots of the Haligtree, and we know he was abducted by Mohg, as Gideon tells us, leading to the inevitable conclusion that Mohg's theft of Miquella somehow halted the process of metamorphosis for both Miquella and the adherents of the Haligtree. We'll return to the mystery of how these two processes of metamorphosis were linked at the end of the video. Before we do, let's first take a look at some of the other major pieces of iconographic evidence found in the Haligtree, starting with the reliefs. Throughout Elphael, carved in relief into the walls themselves, as well as carved into the wooden furniture, we can see a depiction of a shrouded figure holding a staff of sorts close to his chest, and apparently levitating above the surrounding features, which appear to be roots with people embedded into them. Of course, we've seen variations on this root depiction before in the reliefs of the Erdtree's catacombs, as well as in the actual catacomb process of body reabsorption, which we know to be a critical part of the Erdtree's circle of life. But in the Haligtree's roots, we find no such process occurring, no mass of bodies being resorbed into the roots. In fact, in the adjacent crypt, we see sarcophagi of the recumbent effigy style. We'll return to the implication of this specific stylistic choice in a moment, but for now, the point is the bodies are buried in sarcophagi, explicitly not left to be consumed by the roots. To put it bluntly, one buries the dead in stone sarcophagi specifically to avoid the consumption by nature, not to facilitate it. Perhaps this is why, in contrast to the depictions of the Erdtree, which show prominent root systems, the Haligtree's roots are usually minimized, as if they are known to be of lesser importance. Of course, the other feature we have yet to mention in these reliefs is the shrouded figure itself. We have little to go on since, unusually for effigy statues meant to memorialize someone, this one appears to deliberately conceal any identifying features, being deliberately cloaked beyond recognition, or perhaps cloaked to leave the figure's appearance in the mind's eye of the beholder. The one putatively identifying feature is the staff. The real-world inspiration for this comes from the effigy tombs of the Western Church, where church officials are depicted with a staff called a crozier, a characteristic item of the official pontification regalia of bishops, cardinals, and popes. But if we look more closely, there's something quite odd about this crozier in particular. In fact, something that would exclude its function as a staff altogether. The bottom end is sharp, unlike any we know of in real-world iconography. It turns out, though stylistically inspired by pontifical croziers, this is not a ceremonial staff at all. It appears to be a large stake, or perhaps a giant needle, meant to pierce something quite large indeed. Well, do we know of anyone associated with both the Haligtree and with a known fondness for needles? Of course we do. The implication that this is in fact a depiction of Miquella has some startling ramifications. For one, this is a depiction of an adult size and shaped person, something that we know Miquella, cursed with eternal youth, never achieved. Second, if the roots in the background aren't the Haligtrees, what are they? And finally, what's the deal with the needle? What was its purpose? If we can decode the relief depiction, it may unlock the mystery of Miquella's intention in the Haligtree, as it is evidently important enough to be carved into the walls of El Fayel, into its furniture, as well as, in a variation, into the monumental sarcophagi in the crypts, in the innermost sanctum of the Haligtree. So now, we have a real mystery on our hands. Let's start with the question of the needle, which is the easiest to ascertain, and work our way up. Miquella, of course, is well known for the unalloyed gold needles, capable of warding off the influence of outer gods. For example, the unalloyed gold needle used to stave off Millennia's and then Millicent's rot progression, and the unalloyed gold needle used to remove the searing effects of the Flame of Frenzy. That one has to use this needle in the Storm Beyond Time in Farum Azula is no coincidence, as Miquella was not the first to recognize the power of unalloyed gold. He was merely its rediscoverer. The Haligtree reliefs depict a giant version of an unalloyed gold needle meant for, apparently, a similar purpose. Unfortunately, there is scarcely little documentary evidence to guide us, as there is no mention of a giant needle. Instead, we must rely on the iconography itself. What the relief shows, simply, is an adult form Miquella, holding the needle in the aforementioned roots. As the other depictions of Miquella and the needle appear to be partial versions of this full scene, we need only to understand what the relationship is between the needle and the roots, and we can solve the puzzle. And for this, we need a little bit of FromSoftware history. Certain folk traditions, maintained by many to this day, hold that copper nails can be used to kill trees. Actually, a little more specific than that, the copper nails are used to kill the stump and roots of a tree after it has already been felled, as these may persist as a nuisance long after its trunk is cut. So, let's propose a creative solution to our relief mystery, involving the most straightforward components. The needle is an unalloyed gold needle, and the roots depicted are the Erdtrees, the only roots in-game known to and shown to absorb the dead. The purpose of the needle is to kill the Erdtree's roots, as one does with an infested tree. We recognize this would all be perhaps a bit tenuous if not for one important element. We know for a fact that the developers are familiar with, and have actually previously depicted in detail, this process. In Dark Souls 3's Cathedral of the Deep, we see copper nails being used to defend the cathedral against encroaching roots. Of course, that game has a whole recurring trope of invasive tree growth, in some ways the predecessor to what we see in Elden Ring's Aeonia Rotvine or the overgrown invasive roots of Leyndell. In the Cathedral of the Deep, however, the forensics are clear. The nails, which are copper given the green oxidation, are all along the rooftops of the cathedral. And indeed, there is a clear inverse correlation between the copper nails and the root growth. In those areas where there are nails, the growth is contained. And in the areas where there are no nails, it is not. So we know the developers are familiar with and like this concept, making it a plausible inspiration for the Haligtree relief depictions. But it goes from simply plausible to explanatory when we consider the intended target of the needle, the Erdtree, and the infestation it would be culling, undoubtedly Godwyn's Deathblight. It seems Miquella's plan was to use a giant unalloyed gold needle on the roots of the Erdtree itself. This is consistent with Miquella's intent and plot to give Godwyn a true death, an escape from his current soul death infesting the roots of the Erdtree. As the Golden Epitaph sword reads, quote, "A sword made to commemorate the death of Godwyn the Golden, the first of the demigods to die, infused with the humble prayer of a young boy. O brother, Lord brother, please die a true death." End quote. And later on in Castle Sol, an NPC is quite explicit about Miquella's intentions. Quote, "Lord Miquella, forgive me. The sun has not been swallowed. Our prayers were lacking. Your comrade remains soulless. I will never set mine eyes upon it now, your divine Haligtree." End quote. So, Miquella plotted to manifest an eclipse of the sun, which, according to the Eclipse Shodol and Eclipse Crest Great Shield, would drain the sun of its gold color, and is said to keep destined death at bay. We can even see on the banners of Castle Sol this prophetic event taking place, the dripping gold being drained from the sun. So, by draining the sun of its gold, Miquella would have enough gold to fashion a giant unalloyed gold needle, powerful enough to target the Erdtree itself, to free his brother from the curse of undeath, and, in all likelihood, to start his own new age. And, interestingly, we know from Radagon's Rings of Light incantation that Miquella turned to unalloyed gold when it was clear that fundamentalism could not cure millennia's rot. Perhaps he decided that the Erdtree was incurable as well, and only death by needle, stabbed into its roots and embedded soulless body, could stop the spread of Deathblight through the world. So now we know the purpose of the needle, and we have only the final remaining mystery. And if we can solve that, we can put the whole thing together. Why does the depiction of the relief of Miquella show him in adult form, one we know he never actually attained? Well, actually, we've already begun to answer this question. As the NPC in Castle Sol indicates, the eclipse was a prophecy, and in fact, he is lamenting the fact that it did not ultimately come to pass. So too is the Haligtree relief depiction prophecy. It shows the prophecy of Miquella after his metamorphosis into his adult form, wielding his power to cure the Erdtree of Deathblight and usher in a new age. The figure in the relief, having been depicted before Miquella's actual metamorphosis, is deliberately cloaked to conceal any identifying features, so that whatever form adult Miquella ends up taking, the depiction still applies. Understanding this prophecy and its real-world inspirations brings the whole picture into focus. This was a prophecy that the worshippers of Miquella, adherents of the Haligtree, were somehow compelled to believe would occur. In fact, prayed would occur. Why did they pray for it? Well, again, we've actually already begun to answer this. When Miquella's cocoon was stolen from the roots of the Haligtree, it apparently interrupted the process of metamorphosis for his followers as well. That is why we find their cocoons arrested in mid-metamorphosis throughout Elphael. So to his followers, evidently, the process of Miquella's metamorphosis was linked with their own, and only as an adult could he carry out the mercy killing of the Erdtree's infested roots. This has clear, real-world inspirations in the Christian prophecies of the second coming of Christ. In his first phase, so to speak, Jesus is said to have died for the sins of the world. But in his second phase, upon return, he was, and is, prophesied to bring about far more awesome changes to the world. According to the Book of Revelations, Christ's second coming would bring about the apocalypse, wherein, as the Nicene Creed states, quote, "He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end." End quote. All manner of cataclysms, earthquakes, lightning, fiery hail, a seven-headed dragon, and the destruction of Babylon come with the apocalypse, after which Jesus would appear to save the faithful. According to the Gospel writer Matthew, the second coming will be heralded by angelic envoys. Quote, "And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." End quote. More specifically, 7 trumpets in Christianity are said to be a critical sign of the apocalypse and Jesus' second coming. And wouldn't you know it, there are 7 trumpets on the envoy's great horn, wielded by the mysterious envoys who are said to herald the coming of a new age and a new god. Just so, the relief depicts Miquella in a style specifically evocative of Christian eschatological symbolism. Miquella's Second Coming relief is partially modeled after one of the most well-known depictions of the resurrection of neoclassical sculpture. Fittingly, a period in art history aimed at the revival of the classical world. One of the clear, real-world inspirations for Miquella's statue is the Monteverde angel, originally named the Angel of Resurrection. Lauded by contemporary art critics for the perfect molding of the arms in such an unusual position that has become the distinguishing feature of the work, and ultimately copied many times over, including Miquella's relief. The same contemporary descriptions state, quote, "She holds a trumpet in her right hand, as if ready to sound it on the last judgment day," end quote, making the stylistic inspiration right on point with Miquella's Second Coming. The deliberate modifications of the Monteverde angel we've already discussed. The cloaking of the figure to allow the faithful to envisage the metamorphosed Miquella with their mind's eye, and of course, the crozier converted to a giant unalloyed gold needle, with the depiction of its destined target in the background. The Second Coming of Miquella, pious and levitating, promising the world salvation, was much anticipated indeed. So now, finally, let's pull it all together. Miquella created the Haligtree to recreate and innovate upon the life-giving baptismal ritual of Leyndell, such that it would grant rebirth, or metamorphosis, to its faithful. He embedded himself in the roots in an attempt to undergo metamorphosis himself and escape his curse of eternal youth. Perhaps his body was wrapped in the myrrh-like Haligtree sap, just as Jesus' body was wrapped in myrrh after his crucifixion. His followers were compelled to believe that, had he succeeded in this effect, he would come again in glory, in his adult form, and use his unalloyed needle to eradicate the curse of deathblight from this world. Like the Christian apocalypse, the end of the current world order is necessary to bring about a new one, and once the Erdtree was properly dead, the age of the Haligtree could begin. Of course, we know that this was not meant to be. Miquella was abducted, mid-metamorphosis, by his omen half-brother Mohg. Miquella's cocoon and its partially transformed contents now rest upon another pelvic throne in the birthplace of Mohg's new dynasty. The first generation of Albinaurics, seeking salvation through rebirth, were arrested mid-metamorphosis, while the second generation were led by Loretta all the way to the consecrated snowfields, so close to their promised land, only to follow their savior Miquella to the hellish Mohgwyn dynasty. Some even become baptized in blood, a twisted variation of the Zionist trope, if there ever was one. And most tantalizing of all, we know from the statues of Marika and her twin prodigies in the Haligtree, and from Gideon's dialogue,
"The Haligtree, now but a husk. I heard speculation Miquella embedded himself in the Haligtree. But before he could finish, someone cut the tree open and absconded with his infant form. Indeed, it seems those words held weight. How vexing that the all-knowing didn't have the full story. Perhaps the Queen's sorrow was justified."
Perhaps that is why we see the golden oracle envoys in both the Haligtree and the Erdtree, indicating an intentional transfer of power. And perhaps this is the, quote, end that should not be, end quote, that Gideon glimpsed in Marika's will. So, that it would ultimately be an omen, one born without grace, and a demigod child of the queen herself, no less, that would put an end to these dreams, is no mere coincidence. But that is a story for another day.